Compressive asphyxia. It means death due to compression of the lungs. It is the primary cause of death in our two examinations today. The lungs work like a bellows, inhaling air and oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. If the bellows stop or are restricted, carbon dioxide builds up, oxygen drops, the victim passes out, and eventually will die from lack of oxygen. This is how constrictor snakes kill their prey, by slowly compressing the lungs until oxygen is depleted to a critical point. But it can also happen in large crowds, confined in a small area, if there is a sudden surge in any direction. By this method, a person could die, standing up.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleton. Today we will discuss two panics that took place in England. The first was a stampede of children at a magic show during Victorian times. The second was a crush of football fans at a semi-final match during a time when police were on alert for acts of hooliganism. Two crowds, out of control, pushing and forcing themselves in one direction into a space that could not possibly fit them all. Crowd psychology is a relatively recent field given the long history of gathered crowds. In 1841, Charles Mackay wrote a book on the subject titled Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. In 1875, Hippolyte Taine published The Origins of Contemporary France, which included an examination of crowd behavior during the French Revolution. A few years later, Gustave Le Bon classified crowd behavior darkly in three stages: submergence, contagion, and suggestion. An individual loses his sense of self in a crowd, then that individual is heavily influenced by the ideas and emotions of those around him in the crowd. And finally, there's a collective unconscious that forces people into action. Humans become automatons in excited crowds. Sigmund Freud thought that individuals in a crowd tended to revert to primitive ego impulses. That is, people relax their self-control over repressed behaviors and release their primitive mindset. De-individuation theory holds that people in a crowd feel anonymous, unified with the group, and are easily aroused to exhibit excitable behavior. In emergent norm theory, crowds have little in common at the outset, but during a period of milling together, key charismatic members suggest appropriate action and others follow, establishing the crowd norm. Crowds are about conformity. There are also several types of crowds based upon their reason for coming together. In today's episode, we will be examining acquisitive crowds. That is a crowd that comes together to acquire something. In our first example, it is children looking to acquire toys and presents. In our second example, it is sports fans looking to acquire a prime viewing location to watch an important match. The handbills advertising the event were distributed all over the city of Sunderland, England that week, including at most of its schools. The Fays from Tynemouth Aquarium will give a grand day performance for children. In large letters it went on to claim the greatest treat for children ever given. There would be conjurers, ventriloquists, marionettes, and what one would assume was one of the most spectacular magic tricks of the day, the great ghost illusion. The admission price was an absolute bargain, even by 19th century British standards, just 1 penny. Anyone could afford that. Reserved seats were only 2 pennies. But best of all, there would be prizes, lots of prizes, presents, books, and toys. This was a show that would be just too good to pass up, and hardly any kid did pass it up. The location for the event was the Grand Victoria Hall. It had capacity for 2,500 sitting and another 500 standing. More than 2,000 children would show up for the Magic and Variety Show on the sunny Saturday on June 16th, 1883. Yet out of those 2,000 children present, there would only be 20 mothers and no fathers. Sunderland at that time was a bustling shipbuilding city. It was perhaps the greatest shipbuilding city in the greatest maritime nation of the Victorian age. A 1901 census pegged the population at 146,000. It was a working-class town busy with the production of ships, coal, and manufactured products. There was a well-to-do suburb in the north, but most people in Sunderland were poor, and one would imagine under such conditions that children would be quite numerous. A Victorian town with any pretensions needed something for the gregarious entertainment of the age, declared Edward Backhouse, a Quaker and one of Sunderland's most prominent and wealthiest citizens. As an act of philanthropy, he commissioned the building of Victoria Hall to mimic the Crystal Palace and Albert Hall in size and architectural style. It was built in 1872 and stood in the center of the city on the east side of Mowbray Park. It was an imposing brick building in the fashionable Gothic style of that time. Inside there was seating on the ground floor, as well as in the main body of the hall on the first floor, and in the gallery or grand balcony above. Because it was so large, the hall was a popular venue for public meetings and entertainments. There are few records of the meetings and events that took place in the first 10 years of the hall's life, but one can be sure they followed the strict temperance and religious codes of the Quakers. Mr. Fay's show in 1883, with presents promised for poor children, would no doubt have greatly appealed to Edward Backhouse, who had died in 1879. The excited children, ranging in age from 3 to 14, who showed up that day, took their seats in two separate places, the open lower hall and the more confined upper gallery. The trip up to the balcony consisted of 3 flights of stairs with a landing at each floor. It would have appeared like a walk-up apartment, a landing and then a turn up the stairs, a landing, a turn up the stairs, and one more trip up the stairs to get to the balcony. To reach the main body of the hall from the upper gallery consisted of making the same trip down, then turning around a blind corner and descending a flight of stairs no more than 7 feet wide, which deposited you at a 5-foot wide landing that faced a wall. From there, one needed to turn to the left, where there was a 5-foot wide door. Sometime after the original hall had been built, someone added a 3/4-inch thick cane bolt that slid into a hole in the floor, leaving a gap of some 20 inches for passage into the dress circle and eventually the main hall. The reason for this narrow passage was to discourage attendees, particularly children, of passing through without paying admission. The room where this stairway was located would end up being the bottleneck that caused this horrible disaster. Like a bottle filled with a viscous fluid, the contents could not pass through such a narrow opening. That evening, the room would turn into a death pit. Alexander and Annie Fay were fairly well-known performers at that time. News of their act would certainly have reached Sunderland prior to the announcement of the show. In the days before radio and film, theater acts, plays, and musical reviews were the popular entertainment of the time. The Fays and their traveling companions consisted of magicians, puppeteers, ventriloquists, and illusionists. The show started at 3 p.m., and the final act did not occur until almost 2 hours later. One can imagine the excitement building up for the 2,000 children present at the hall. For his finale, Alexander Fay hatched some pigeons and set them free to fly around the hall. Following this act, sweets were distributed to those closest to the stage. Then finally, after all of that anticipation, the presents were handed out to those children with the lucky numbers on their tickets. There was only one problem. None of the children in the upper balcony were getting any of the presents. The performers were handing those out only to the children in the lower hall. Panic erupted in the upper gallery. The thought occurred, and was probably voiced, that all of the presents would be given away to the children on the ground floor. In a mad rush, the more than 1,000 children in the upper balcony filed out the doors and down the stairs in a maddening rush, afraid that whoever was last was certain to miss out on the prizes. Down each level they trampled, charging down and around each flight of stairs through a narrow hallway that was designed to slow down the flow of large crowds. When the children at the front reached that final level, they headed around the blind corner and down the stairs into that darkened room and came face to face with a door that was no more than 20 inches open, just wide enough to allow one child at a time. We can presume there was a battle to get through this narrow opening, and that 2 children may have attempted to get through at once. Whatever happened next, the children became stuck, unable to get through the narrow passage and unable to back up. The reason they couldn't back up, or even move over, was because of the constant flow of children running around the blind corner and down the stairs. Children piled on top of children, and more children kept coming. Certainly there were screams, but in the excitement of the moment, none of the children realized the screams they heard in front of them were due to pain and anguish. The room became a pit, funneling child after child to the bottom of the stairs with no way out, and still more children came. After only a few moments, the pit had grown 5 to 6 feet deep with children. And once caught up in the rush, there was no turning back. A child would just get caught up in the onrushing tide. There were no theater employees present during this human stampede. All of the adults were in the lower gallery, and most were oblivious to the events that were happening just beyond the entrance to that area. The first adult to become aware of the unfolding catastrophe was probably Charles Heseltine, an employee of Faye's. From the inside of the lower gallery, he was attempting to pull children through the opening without success. Frederick Graham, the manager of the hall, was making his customary rounds that evening. As Graham approached the bolted door from the interior of the lower gallery, he could hear screaming, groans, and noises of struggle. He found Heseltine working feverishly to retrieve children from the mass of humanity on the other side of the door. Graham reached through Heseltine's legs to release the bolt, but he was unsuccessful in doing this, as the bolt was either bent from the weight of the children or stuck in place against its slot. Graham ran back to the lower gallery and up another stairway. On the way to the pit, he was joined by 2 or 3 other men and was able to find another person to alert the police and medical authorities. Making their way through the crowd of children, they entered the final stair passage where the bolted door was located. The children were massed in a body the whole of the way down the steps, Graham said, and at the bottom a sickening spectacle was presented, the poor things being crowded together in a struggling heap. We pushed our way through the steps, getting the children pushed back and driven onto the corridor leading to the dress circle. We lost no time in pushing through the children on the steps and reaching as near the bottom as we could get. When we reached the 4th step from the bottom, we found the children packed in a mass from that place, over the whole of the landing below. There seemed to be hundreds of them. The children were lying, wedged together, 8 deep, and it was very difficult to get at them. The 4 men and a police constable found the children so tangled together that it was impossible to move some of them without causing further injury or death. Eventually, they removed those children that were loose enough from the mass to be rescued. In this way, they were able to remove a great many children before more help arrived. However, they were unable to save most of the children at the bottom, who had suffocated or died of other injuries. One by one, the bodies of the children were laid out in the lower hall and in the dress circle. In all, 189 children died in the stampede for presents. The area that they had been crammed into was no larger than 7 by 7 feet square and 6 feet high. News spread quickly, and soon parents and other citizens were flocking to the scene of the disaster. The mayor summoned the police force, but realizing he didn't have an adequate force on hand, he put out a call to the nearest military barracks. Grief-stricken parents were confronted with a scene of infant corpses laid out in front of the hall. Some of the children who'd been brought out for air had expired from their injuries. One man was able to break through this cordon of soldiers and police to confront the body of his dead son. He threw his arms above his head and shouted, "My son is dead! My son is dead! I will never more go home! Never more!" It took several other people to calm this man down. The catastrophe cast a pall over the city of Sunderland. The next school day, many of the classrooms were noticeably void of many of their students. Queen Victoria sent a message to the grieving families. Victoria Hall was boarded up after the incident and remained closed until 1906, when it reopened as the Alexandra Hall. But it remained cursed. Performers refused to perform there, and audiences would not attend if they had. In 1941, a German parachute mine landed on top of the structure and exploded, causing so much damage the building had to be demolished. The second of our stampede and crush disasters also took place in England, 124 miles to the south and 106 years later. This crush happened at a football stadium in Sheffield. I'll be calling it football since that is what they call it in England and just about everywhere else outside of North America. The stadium is called Hillsborough, after the local political district, and it is home to the football club Sheffield Wednesday. You have to like a team that's named after a day of the week. On this particular day, April 15th, 1989, Sheffield was playing host to the Football Association semifinals, a meeting between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. It would be a rematch of the prior year's semifinal, and the winner would go on to play for the cup. As anyone knows, English football fans can get very passionate about their sport, and this match was generating a great deal of excitement. However, to examine some of the root causes of the crush at Hillsborough Stadium, we have to start not on the day of the crush, but some 6 months earlier. Back in October 1988, there was a first-year police constable from the South Yorkshire jurisdiction on foot patrol in the city of Sheffield. It was nighttime, and he had been cut off from his fellow officers. He was alone, patrolling the grounds of a convent, when he was attacked by two men wearing military fatigues and black balaclavas to hide their identity. The attackers forced the constable face down into the mud, cuffed his hands behind his back, and pointed a gun at his head. They pulled his trousers down and gave the young policeman every indication they were about to violate his person and then shoot him. But instead of hearing the click of a gun trigger, the constable heard the click of a camera. It turned out the whole incident was just a prank. The attackers took off their masks, and identifying themselves as senior officers, they laughed loudly at the young man who was still face down in the mud. In the U.S., we call this kind of a prank on new recruits hazing. And just like in the U.S., hazing can go too far. But the victim did not get over this prank immediately. It took many counseling sessions for him to recover. Meanwhile, 5 of the officers involved in the prank were suspended from duty. But it didn't stop there. The investigation uncovered a wider problem of pranking and intimidation. Eventually, Member of Parliament Martin Flannery heard about the issue and took action. He had the chief superintendent at the time, Brian Mole, replaced by David Duckenfield. All of this pertains to our stadium story because Mole was going to be the policeman in charge of security for the semifinal match at Hillsborough. Mole had numerous years of experience in this role, and he knew how to handle large crowds at the football stadium. Duckenfield had no experience overseeing security at football matches. He was unfamiliar with the layout of Hillsborough Stadium and had never been responsible for a crowd this size of the one that was about to see Liverpool take on Nottingham Forest. All of these factors would turn out to be a considerable oversight, and it happened just 3 weeks before the big match. It was the Football Association that chose Hillsborough. They needed a neutral site. Sheffield is located in between Liverpool and Nottingham. It was also one of the premier stadiums and had hosted 5 semifinals previously. But Hillsborough was also an old stadium. It was originally built in 1899, and its most recent renovation took place in 1960. It had a limited number of turnstiles, and many of those were in old and decrepit shape. The West Stand entrance had only 7 turnstiles, and every fan was required to present their ticket before passing through the turnstile. The West End, bordered by Lepping's Lane, was a notorious bottleneck. The road and the nearby River Don constricted the approach to the West End to a narrow strip of land. Because of a rise in hooliganism that began in the 1970s, stadium officials had made several changes to the standing area at the bottom of the West Stand inside the stadium. The terrace, as it is called, is just that, a cement terrace of graduated steps, a few inches high, that led from the tunnel to a 10-foot-high fence that separated the fans from the pitch or field of play. Crush barriers had been added horizontally to prevent crowds of fans from getting pushed toward the fence. More fencing had been added vertically, creating pens, or fence-enclosed areas that prevented fans from moving right, left, or forward. The fences had been strengthened and built high. They featured overhangs on the terrace side to discourage fans from jumping up them and jumping onto the pitch. A great number of precautions were taken to make certain that hooliganism and pitch invasion would not occur, but it came at a cost. As a result of the numerous changes, the stadium's safety certificate had been made invalid, and prior to the match it had not been renewed. Crushes at football stadiums were nothing new in England. The first final at Wembley Stadium, the now home to every final, saw an excess capacity crowd of 200,000, and some minor injuries due to that crush and pitch invasion. In 1946, at Burnden Park in Bolton, 33 people were killed in a crush after numerous fans without tickets found their way through an open gate. In 1971, 66 spectators died at a match at Ibrox Stadium in Glasgow. That crush was caused by fans leaving before the end of the game, then turning around and rushing up the stairwell into other fans after a late goal was scored. In a 1981 semi-final at Hillsborough between Tottenham and Wolverhampton, 38 people were injured in a crush. The opening of gates leading out to the pitch relieved pressure and prevented more people from getting hurt or dying. In 1985, a crush at the European Cup final in Hazel, Belgium, led to the deaths of 38 spectators when a fight between Liverpool and Juventus fans led to a panic. That led to a ban on British clubs participating in European competition. The match tickets instructed ticket holders to arrive 15 minutes before kickoff at 3 p.m. The fans arriving from Nottingham and Liverpool were unfamiliar with the layout of Hillsborough Stadium. Organizers segregated the ticket holders to avoid any mingling that might lead to a fight. Nottingham Forest was allocated the south and east ends, while Liverpool was allocated the north and west ends, including Leppings Lane. Although there were more Liverpool supporters, the greater allocation of tickets were sent to Nottingham Forest. Again, to avoid any mixing of rival clubs, the turnstiles for the north stands were closed off, and all Liverpool supporters were forced to enter through Leppings Lane. In a previous semi-final match, there had been 10 chartered trains taking fans from Liverpool to Sheffield. By 1988, that was down to 3, and for the 1989 match, it was just 1 train. That meant that many of the fans would be arriving all at one time. Supporters began arriving in great numbers between 2:30 and 2:40 p.m. Shortly thereafter, a bottleneck began to develop. People presenting tickets for a different entry point, and people without tickets were turned away, but because of the onward progression of the crowd, they had nowhere to move to. As game time grew closer, the conditions at the Leppings Lane entrance became worse. Some fans were visibly in distress. They were not close to the turnstiles, and the forward progress of the fans behind them only served to push them closer against the people in front of them. Fans and police were struggling to breathe, and mounted officers were also stuck in the crush. At 2:50 p.m., fans outside the stadium could hear fans inside the stadium cheering as the players were introduced. One of the senior officers at Leppings Lane radioed his superiors asking that the game be delayed, but his request was denied. Duckenfield at this moment was in the police control box inside the stadium. The box had a commanding view of the terraces as it was located very close by. It also contained a number of closed-circuit TV cameras so that there was an excellent live video feed of the events occurring at Leppings Lane, even if radio communication was a bit faulty at that time. Duckenfield's senior officer at Leppings Lane did get through by radio to Duckenfield and informed him that if one of the large exit gates wasn't opened immediately, there would be a fatal crush at the turnstiles. Duckenfield hesitated. If the gates were opened, fans would rush through, many without tickets, meaning overcrowding in the stadium. Opening the gates might lead to a crush somewhere else. But knowing that his officers were in distress, Duckenfield gave the order to open the gates. On his command, Gate C was opened. Gate C was to the side of the turnstiles, and the crowd nearest the gate rushed through. Opposite Gate C was the tunnel that led to the terraces. Above the tunnel, in large capital letters, was the word "Standing." If a fan wanted to get into the stadium as quickly before kickoff as possible, the shortest route would be through the tunnel and into the pens located on the terrace. There were no signs indicating the direction to the other stands, and there were no stadium employees or police directing people away from the tunnel. The tunnel could have been closed off, but it wasn't. 2,000 fans waiting outside at Lepping's Lane now passed through the open exit gate, with most of the first wave heading straight into the tunnel. The tunnel sloped downward and acted as a funnel directing the fans into pens 3 and 4. Those pens were already full to capacity, while the larger pens to the sides were only at half capacity. Soon pens 3 and 4 were at double their capacity. The crush barriers funneled people into narrow confines wherever a crush barrier was absent, while the fencing on the side of the pens and at the base of the terrace acted as a container. The force of the oncoming crowd pushed people into the fencing. At 3 p.m., the match kicked off, and supporters in the other stands cheered. But already it had become apparent that something was wrong in the West End terraces. People were screaming. Others fell unconscious, either fainting and falling to the ground or fainting in place, standing up. Survivors described being gradually compressed, unable to move, their heads locked between arms and shoulders, faces gasping in panic. They were aware that people were dying and they were helpless to save themselves. It was becoming more and more difficult to breathe. Fans screamed at the police to open the perimeter fencing and allow them onto the pitch. But video from the game revealed that police officers did nothing. In fact, many beat back the fans, more concerned about hooliganism than a crush, forcing them back into the pen. Duckenfield was observing these events from the police control box located next to the pens at a height of 2 meters above the terrace. He had a clear, close-up view of what was happening, yet he failed to understand the distress of the fans. He was still preparing to fight a pitch invasion. He depended on his senior officers to update him on events. When some of the embattled fans managed to pry open a side gate, he ordered his officers to prepare for crowd control. The single, narrow gates that led to the pens were opened, and people started spilling out onto the pitch, some of them staggering, many of them fainting. All the while the match continued. Other fans had managed to climb over the fence and overhang to get onto the pitch. It wasn't until 6 minutes after kickoff, with bodies piling up behind and around the goal net, that the match was called. As the situation grew dire, fans began tearing at the perimeter fencing, separating the pens from the pitch. Fans in the upper stands were reaching down to help some of the people trapped in the back to climb up to the next deck. Fans that had already made it onto the pitch were assisting other fans over the perimeter fencing. As the grouping of people in the pens cleared, it became apparent that a number of fans had been crushed up against the fence or against each other and were suffering from compressive asphyxia, or a crushing of the lungs. The force of the crowd had been great enough to twist the thick steel bars that were bolted into the cement and acted as crush barriers. As the bodies laid out on the pitch multiplied, the area quickly became crowded. Many of the injured were unconscious, some were not breathing, and some had no heartbeat. It was clear that if any could be rescued, urgent resuscitation was necessary. A call went out for paramedics, and a batch of ambulances arrived at the stadium within minutes. Shortly they were completely overwhelmed by the number of injured and dying who needed immediate assistance. Because of poor coordination and logistics, only 3 ambulances made it inside the stadium and onto the pitch. The rest waited outside the stadium in a queue of congested ambulances. In desperation, fans tore down the advertising hoardings or billboards that encircled the field and used those as makeshift stretchers. Victims were loaded onto the hoardings and carried across the entire pitch to the ambulances waiting outside the stadium. The first few minutes following the crush were crucial. Those suffering from asphyxia needed immediate help in order to survive. On the pitch, fans, some with medical backgrounds, began assisting the injured with CPR. They were joined by some of the police officers present, but a greater number of police officers had been put to use forming a cordon across the pitch to keep Nottingham Forest supporters away from Liverpool fans. Instead, their services could have been better used assisting the injured. Some of the fans assisting the injured were held back by the police cordon. As it turned out, only 14 of the 96 fatalities would actually make it to a hospital. This delay greatly inflated the number of people who died at Hillsborough. Those who did not survive were brought to a gymnasium inside the stadium. The gymnasium was divided into 3 sections using sheets hung from netting, an area for holding bodies laid out in body bags, an area for police officers to eat, and an area for police officers to conduct interviews. Each deceased person was numbered and placed in a body bag, their face cleaned by a police officer using a sponge or rag. Polaroid photographs were taken, numbered, and posted on a board near the entrance of the gymnasium. Relatives and friends searching for their loved ones were held at a vacated boys' club close to the area's main police station. At 9:30 p.m., 6 hours after the evacuation of the pens, the process of identification began. Through the night, families were bussed from the boys' club to the gymnasium, queuing at its entrance to view the photographs. On recognition, the numbered body was wheeled on a trolley to the gymnasium door. The body bag was unzipped, the identification made, and the body returned to the gymnasium floor. The bereaved were prohibited from touching their loved ones and were escorted to the interview area by police officers, ostensibly to answer routine questions and formalize identification. Within a month of the disaster, the Hillsborough Family Support Group was formed to represent the interests of all bereaved families. Their experiences on the night of the disaster indicated that an agenda was forming that focused on fans' behavior. Barry Devonside had traveled to Hillsborough with his son Christopher. Unable to find Christopher, he searched the stadium and hospitals. Returning to the stadium gymnasium, he recognized a photograph. Devonside demanded to be granted a moment to touch and kiss his dead son. Instead, he was taken to a table where officers asked for a statement of identification. He was asked their time of arrival in Sheffield and whether they had stopped for a drink. The questioning focused on alcohol, pubs, off-license liquor sales, and supermarkets, and whether he had witnessed any heavy drinking or bad behavior. Devonside voiced his disgust that minutes after identifying his dead son, he was being subjected to what felt like an interrogation, like we had done something terribly wrong. This was the common routine at the gymnasium. Victims' families were shown the bodies of their loved ones after identifying them by photograph, and then they were interrogated by police who seemed intent on establishing a pattern of drunken rowdiness and hooliganism prior to the crush. Earlier in the day, at just 15 minutes after kickoff, Graham Kelly, the Football Association chief executive, visited the police control box to ask Duckenfield the cause of the commotion in the Leppings Lane terraces. Duckenfield told Graham that the fans had forced open Gate C, rather than the police opening the gate in response to Duckenfield's order. It was a bald-faced lie. Graham, who may have been able to offer assistance during the crush, instead treated it as an instance of hooliganism. Years later, under investigation, Duckenfield admitted he lied. The lie meant that instead of proceeding in an atmosphere of crisis and life-threatening circumstances, the police and stadium security treated the incident as a matter of crowd control. It is beyond a doubt that many of the victims who died at Hillsborough died because they did not receive proper attention and medical care in the immediate moments following the crush. Had they responded to a crush instead of a crowd control situation, many more people would have been saved. The accusation of public drunkenness and hooliganism was further inflated when the British tabloid The Sun published a story on its front page under the headline, "The Truth." The article alleged that some fans had picked the pockets of some of the victims, that some of the fans had urinated on the police officers, and that other fans beat up a constable who was giving CPR to one of the victims. The article went on to blame the fans for impeding the rescue of the victims by attacking the first responders. The editor, Kelvin Mackenzie, selected only the interviews of the police and government officials. He never published the comments of the fans or the families of the victims. Mackenzie green-lighted the entire article, even though many of the paper's staff had deep reservations about doing so. Publisher Rupert Murdoch, who you may remember showed the courage to publish an article against Jim Jones in episode 20, was the only person powerful enough to stop Mackenzie. But he chose to let the story go through. Liverpool residents were outraged. They boycotted the newspaper. To this day, Sun sales in Liverpool are incredibly low, and the newspaper's popularity declined precipitously across the nation following the story. But the Hillsborough tragedy did not subside from British consciousness, and investigations continue to this day. Returning to Sunderland, back in the 19th century, an investigation into the cause of the stampede took place shortly after the crush at Victoria Hall, under the direction of the county coroner. During the investigation, the coroner and a jury questioned Alexander Fay, Charles Heseltine, Mr. Fay's assistant, Frank Cause, a renowned architect and expert witness, George Hoskins, the architect, George Wilson, a school headmaster, Frederick Graham, the caretaker at Victoria Hall, Charles Wybert, Mr. Fay's manager, and several children who survived the event. The jury determined that the main cause of death was the partially closed door bolted into the floor. The jury could not determine who was responsible for bolting the door, but if it had not been bolted, the accident would not have been nearly as severe. They determined that Wybert, by arrangement with the operators, was responsible for not providing caretakers and assistants to preserve order. They recommended the removal of the bolted door, but found all other entrances and exits sufficient. Graham was not held responsible, but the hall operator was instructed to work more closely with the entertainment to show them the layout of the hall. No one was held accountable. A month later, another inquiry was held in a different jurisdiction, re-examining the case and the witnesses. That jury also concluded the bolted door was the cause of most of the deaths, but could not determine who was responsible for bolting the door. However, they did answer a number of questions. Alexander Fay and Victoria Hall operator Stephen Coates were responsible for the safety of the children on that day. The prime negligence of duty was lack of attendance to oversee the orderly passage of children. That even if the door had not been bolted, there was not sufficient staff for such a large event. That Frederick Graham was negligent for not informing Fay about the bolted door, that Graham was negligent of not bolting the door to the wall so that the opening would have been a full 5 feet, that the directors of the hall were negligent for not instructing Graham to show this bolted door to any entertainers using the hall, that the parents of the children were negligent for not investigating the number of adults present at the event before allowing their children to attend without adult supervision, and that the various schoolmasters were negligent for allowing the distribution of free tickets and for aiding in the canvassing of the children for the event without first examining the amount of adult supervision that would be on hand for the event. No one was punished for their negligence. However, the jury did recommend that children be discouraged from attending such events without proper adult supervision, that all buildings of public assembly have doors that open outward, that proprietors be held accountable for security at such events, and that inspectors be established to monitor safety and compliance before and during such events. As a result, due to public outcry, legislation was passed requiring a minimum number of outward opening doors in the event of emergencies for all buildings that feature public entertainment. That legislation led to the invention of the push-bar emergency door, which I am certain you have encountered any time you exited a theater. Victoria Hall and the investigations that followed did play an important part in making theaters safer places for large assemblies. Returning to Sheffield in the 20th century, following the Hillsborough disaster, Lord Justice Taylor was appointed to conduct an inquiry into the events. After 31 days, the inquiry published 2 reports, an interim report which laid out events of the day and conclusions, and a final report which outlined general recommendations on football ground safety. Lord Justice Taylor concluded that the main reason so many people died and were injured at Hillsborough was due to the failure of police control, particularly the opening of Exit Gate C, the decision not to close the tunnel prior to opening Gate C, and the decision not to delay the game when a crush was developing at the entrances at Leppings Lane. Taylor also found that the number of turnstiles was inadequate for the number of people waiting to get inside, and the design and layout of the crush barriers contributed to the fatalities. Fans should have been directed to other stands where there was still plenty of empty space. The official capacity of the central pens was 2,200, but after the installation of the crush barriers, that dropped to 1,700. It is estimated that by kickoff, there were more than 3,000 people in the central pens. It is rare for pitch invasions to occur at the beginning of a game, but once fans had climbed over the fence but stayed away from the pitch, it should have been obvious in the police control box that pitch invasion was not the problem. The overemphasis on pitch security versus public safety was one of the major causes of death and injury. As for the credibility of police testimonial during the investigation, Taylor concluded, in all, some 65 police officers gave oral evidence at the inquiry. Sadly, I must report that for the most part, the quality of their evidence was in inverse proportion to their rank. It is a matter of regret that at the hearing, and in their submissions, the South Yorkshire police were not prepared to concede they were in any respect at fault in what occurred. The police case was to blame the fans for being late and drunk, and to blame the club for failing to monitor the pens. Such an unrealistic approach gives cause for anxiety as to whether lessons have been learnt. It would have been more seemly and encouraging for the future if responsibility had been faced. In the years that followed the disaster, there was a feeling that the full facts were not in the public domain, and a suspicion that some facts were deliberately covered up. The Hillsborough Family Support Group campaigned for the release of all relevant documents. In April 2009, the government asked the Home Office and Department of Culture, Media, and Sport to investigate the best way for this information to be made public. Home Secretary Alan Johnson announced the formation of the Hillsborough Independent Panel with a remit to oversee full public disclosure of relevant government and local information within the limited constraints set out in the disclosure protocol, and consult with the Hillsborough families to ensure that the views of those most affected by the disaster are taken into account. An archive of all relevant documentation was created, and a report was produced in 2012. The Hillsborough Independent Panel concluded, "It is evident from the documents disclosed to the panel that the safety of the crowd admitted to the terrace was compromised at every level. Access to the turnstiles from the public highway, the condition and adequacy of the turnstiles, the management of the crowd by South Yorkshire Police and the Sheffield Wednesday Football Club stewards, alterations to the terrace, particularly the construction of pens, the condition and placement of crush barriers, access to the central pens via a tunnel descending at a 1-in-6 gradient, emergency egress from the pens via small gates in the perimeter fence, and lack of precise monitoring of crowd capacity within the pens." Going further than the Taylor report, the panel also found a police mindset overly concerned about crowd disorder and the slow realization that there was an overcrowding issue rather than a pitch invasion contributed to the number of deaths and injuries. The panel was unable to find a credible rationale for the replacement of Chief Superintendent Mole with Duckenfield. There was no forethought given to the opening of Gate C when it was already apparent that pens 3 and 4 were filled beyond capacity. There should not have been more tickets issued to Nottingham Forest fans than Liverpool fans. The emergency responders were slow to respond to the emerging disaster, and there was little or no leadership and organization when they did. The police questioning of the victims' families regarding social and drinking habits of the deceased was insensitive, intrusive, and irrelevant. The original coroner investigating the matter should not have cut off any inquests after 3:15 p.m., a time that the coroner had personally determined was the period in which all victims would have died from suffocation or their injuries. This was determined to be completely erroneous, and there was substantial evidence that many of the victims were still alive and could have been saved after 3:15 p.m. But probably most importantly, the panel concluded that drunkenness or inappropriate behavior on the part of the fans was not a contributing factor to the disaster. Senior South Yorkshire police had conspired to steer the narrative of the Taylor inquiry by overemphasizing the matter of public drunkenness and pressuring junior officers to write supportive statements, and that all of the assertions made in the Sun were false, and that many fans actually aided in rescuing and evacuating the injured and dying. The investigations continue to this day. Thus we have two panics, a stampede and a crush. In each incident, there was one crucial element missing that could have prevented or mitigated these disasters. That is the element of crowd control by the authorities in position to prevent a panic. In our first case, it was an absence of adults who could have directed the children away from the dangerous staircase or calmed down the excited crowd. In the second case, it was a mishandling of the situation by the police and stadium security. Had the tunnel been closed, had the crowd been diverted to other sections, had the police responded quickly and appropriately to a crush instead of to a pitch invasion, Hillsborough may have never happened. Thank you again for listening. I greatly appreciate all of your support. Please tell any history buffs or disaster fanatics that you know about the show. You can find the Podcast of Doom on iTunes, Stitcher, and Blueberry. You can visit the website at www.thepodcastofdoom.com or like us on Facebook. Please do email me with any comments, questions, or suggestions. The email address is podcastofdoom@aol.com. Thank you for your support, and I hope that you continue to listen to the podcast. In the next episode, we will look at the Assassins, a cult of people who lived in a mountain fortress and terrorized their opponents with acts of violence. These types of things have been going on for a long time in every part of the world. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.